Hello and welcome to this special episode of The Sceptic with Professor Doug Stokes, who is a professor in international security and strategy at Exeter University and a senior advisor to the Prosperity Institute. Doug and I discuss whether peace is on the cards in Ukraine, the effect of the war on Russia, the future of NATO and what the war means for Europe, and Trump's trade war and whether it will spell the end of dollar hegemony. And in the premium section, we discuss the long-term possibility of detente with Russia, whether the need to rearm will mean the end of net zero here in Britain, and also the roots of the free speech crisis in Britain's universities. Welcome to The Sceptic, Professor Doug Stokes.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Great to be here.
Yeah, good to have you here. Okay, so let's start with Ukraine then. Of course, that's been knocked out of the news a bit at the moment. We're recording this with the tariff situation. We're going to get onto that in a second. But I think both of those obviously do reflect the change in policy from the Donald Trump White House and administration. And, so we're about half a month into this supposed ceasefire, aren't we? But that hasn't really happened. And so where are we at in the Ukraine situation in general? And I suppose in a more long-term sense, is peace on the cards?
Where are we at? Well, obviously the ceasefire is going nowhere at the moment. And I guess the reason is that Russia feels it's got the wind under its sails. We've seen quite interesting developments on the part of the Trump administration, i.e. he's become much warmer to Russia and to Putin. He clearly sees geopolitics and world politics in very highly interpersonal terms. If he likes that person, then it's kind of going well, rather than necessarily having a cognizance of the deeper structural context or the deeper nuances of world politics and history and geopolitics. So he's got an interesting style. Obviously very counterintuitive. My sense so there's lots of broad stuff you could talk about. So my sense on Trump would be that he has an impatience on the Ukraine conflict. He sees it very much as a Biden type thing. Clearly doesn't like Ukraine very much because of the Hunter Biden laptop. What he sees as the Biden family's machinations, the alleged machinations and corruption with the Ukrainian regime. And also sees, I guess, he sees Ukraine and the Ukraine conflict as a sideshow in relation to the bigger picture for America's national security interests. And if you look at some of the key thinkers around Trump, so Elbridge Colby and others, they kind of come from the realist school of thought. And the realist school of thought has long been very skeptical of the US's post-war hegemonic role. So if we think about the American grand strategy in the post-war international system after the end of the Second World War, it essentially took on a kind of superintendent role of the global economy and of the Western-led liberal international order. And it did very well out of that order. And you can make a very strong argument it continues to do very well out of that order in a kind of structural sense, in the sense that the kind of the subtle forms of leverage it gives the American state to structure the domestic and international preferences of other politically equal but security and economically subordinate states, and we're seeing that playing out now. But obviously, we've had the bipolar system in the Cold War, and then we had the post-Cold War period and the moment of unipolarity. So we had globalization, the so-called Washington Consensus, and when America's foreign policy elites looked out onto the world, they felt they wanted to do a form of kind of informal and formal imperial reordering. If the world didn't look like America, it was in a state of existential crisis and anxiety. So it wanted to create a series of mini-me's out there. And that was put on steroids under kind of neoconservative theory and the Iraq conflict in Afghanistan. So in many ways, the social forces that underpin Trump and Trumpism are a reaction to that liberal hegemonic grand strategy that we saw. And is far more skeptical of globalization, far more skeptical of the cost-benefit analysis of America's liberal hegemonic project. And that then spills over into its position on Ukraine. And if we think about it on world scale terms, in a brutal sense, Russia has nuclear weapons. But if we took nuclear weapons out of the equation, then Russia is, on pure power terms, not much going on with it at all, really. This isn't mean to disrespect Russia and its incredible contribution to world civilization and its history and the sacrifices it made in the Second World War and So no disrespect to Russia or the Russian people, but on pure sort of geopolitical terms, it's a tiny economy. It's very dependent upon energy. It's quite a corrupt a dark economy, militarily. So we can go on to the Ukraine thing. So even militarily, if you look at the data on Ukraine, Ukraine has been an absolute disaster for Russia. Conservative estimates put the Russian casualty figures dead and wounded. But when we say wounded, I mean, you're out the picture, full stop, pretty much forever. Between about 500,000 British Army estimates, 800 to a million casualties. The Russian economy has obviously been very badly damaged with sanctions, and we're seeing oil prices drop now as a result of the tariffs, which will have massive implications for the Russian economy. Demographically, Russia isn't doing very well. Russia holds about 20% of Ukrainian territory, which is about the same that it held in 2022. So they're making small advances, but the consequences of those military advances that it's making are massive on the Russian economy and personnel. So and Ukraine has adapted very, very well. It's been an incredible fighting machine with its drone technology, its intelligence. It's made some very bold. It's resisted very well. So Ukraine's been a disaster for Russia in many ways. Before the war, we saw Russia as this great monster and this threat. And but now we see it far more in terms of it's been denuded in many ways. So that there are interesting implications for Russia and for the future of security. If you want to, I'll stop talking in a second. But if you want to talk about NATO and what that means for European geopolitics, given the American light NATO security order, we can talk about that if you want, because that's also very, very interesting as well.
Yeah, let's definitely get onto that in a moment. But just on Russia there, so one potential, if not benefit to Russia, then certainly cost to the West that's been pointed out of the war is Russia potentially turning towards China and also, improving their own domestic manufacturing potentially. How much of a problem do you think that is for the West?
I think that the China-Russia relationship is always going to be desperately fraught. Okay. Historically fought. They fought major wars, and Russia and Russian nationalism in particular is not going to be particularly happy to be a supplicant of the Chinese. So there's always going to be that tension. They share a 2,500 wide land border. China has its eyes on bits of Russian territory, and China historically sort of gives money and is brotherly and all that, but then calls in the debts. And the terms for calling in the debt, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, tend to be quite hard. So Russia's a proud nation. So at the moment, they're kind of frenemy. I'd see them more as frenemies. The big enemy for them at the moment is America and the kind of the unipolar world order. So Russia has an interest in, pushing back against that. And China has an interest in that too. And one could argue that it's been put on steroids now with the tariffs. But even then, if there's a resolution on so as we speak, yesterday, Trump put 104% tariffs on Chinese goods. We can come on to that as well if you want to talk about that and what that may mean. But one could see if that's dialed back, then part of that dialogue between Xi Jinping and Trump could be the wedging apart that Russia-Sino relationship too. So in terms of Russian manufacturing, yeah, they can manufacture stuff. A lot of their economy now is very much based around a war economy. About 40% of GDP now is spent on the war. But like any major or any power, you are very heavily dependent upon highly advanced technology, global supply chains, stuff like that. And Russia just simply doesn't have that capacity to do that. Even China, when you get down to the cutting edge aspects of technology, chips, etc., China doesn't do particularly well on that stuff either. Nano chips and these kind of things. So Russia can smash out the tanks and can smash out the big stuff and can put the old Soviet era bombs and put some glide GPS systems on them. No doubt about that. But in terms of high-tech manufacturing, that's before you get into the dysfunction of the Russian economy, the kind of, and the kind of oligarch and if one thing we do know is if you want to be truly integrated in the global economy, you need a sort of transparent financial sector. Investors have to be confident if they're putting money into your country that they're gonna have equality before the law. So when you do run a system like Russia runs and Putin runs, where if you fall out of favor with the leader, it could go badly wrong. And maybe Trump should listen to this too. Then you rock confidence in your economy. So I see the China-Russia relationship as more fraught. It's a marriage of convenience right now, but I think that's a tense one.
Yeah, and so let's move on to NATO then and Europe. I mean, so of course the US hasn't said it's going to pull out of NATO, but there are some very Eurosceptical voices in the American administration now. And certainly what they are saying is that Europe does need to up its defense spending. In the long term, how serious is the US about NATO, do you think?
Well, I think the current, if we go to NATO, right, what is NATO ultimately? NATO is a security alliance, and we kind of invoke this idea of Article 5, collective defense. And so the common perception of Article 5 is that if you attack one, you attack all, and therefore nobody will attack a NATO member, because if you go after one, you're going to go after them all, they're all going to come after you. But that isn't how Article 5 actually works. It says if one is attacked, then they're going to have a conference or a discussion about how they may either individually and or collectively respond. That's Article 5. So that itself puts NATO in a slightly different framework. But on that, I think that America for a long time has been deeply skeptical and or resented what they would see as a European security free riding on the NATO relationship, which is kind of true, really. You know, the Turkey and America and other non-European members spend huge amounts of money on within the NATO context. But having said that, and to push back against that to somewhat, you have to understand what the geopolitical purpose of NATO really was and is historically. So its geopolitical purpose, obviously, during the Cold War was about the containment of the Soviet Union, and in the post-Cold War, kind of pushing out that liberal hegemonic order that we discussed earlier on. But there's a deeper geopolitical purpose to NATO, which is the pacification of the emergence of peer competition amongst other great centers of power. And one of the obvious centers of power would be a more unified or a more geopolitically cohesive Europe. So NATO, into some sense, is the American superintendents in Europe has overdetermined European security relationships and alliance systems. And in return, it solves the collective action problems of European security. But that also means then it's unlikely to see the emergence of Europe as an autonomous strategic actor within the global economy and or world politics, which has worked very well for the Americans. If we think about one of the key reasons why America has been so militarily dominant in the post-war international system, is because by doing that, it gets to structure the domestic and international preferences of other states. Yeah. So essentially, if you rely upon the Americans for security, which is exactly what Trump is trying to do now, if you rely upon the Americans for security, they also have a lot of control over your domestic and international foreign policy and domestic policy preferences. Just go back to the Cold War, for example, the Plaza Accords between Japan and the US. The US went to Japan and said, you need to revalue the yen downwards because your motorcycles and your car were destroying the auto industry. And if you don't do that, we're going to pull out of your security guarantees. So there's a very interesting, very misunderstood or often not understood or not seen at all, but in the game of world politics, that security leverage and security alliance system gives the hegemonic power incredible structuring opportunities over subordinate states. So the NATO relationship has historically been about as much about that, the pacification of the emergence of a viable peer competitor. So in the European geopolitical space, as it has been about protecting Europe. So to go back to your question, the interesting thing now is as America begins to withdraw from European security. We're already now seeing very significant pan-European security cooperation. The EU is talking about hundreds of billions or 2 trillion geopolitical fund by 2030. We're seeing other forms of bilateral and multilateral forms of defence cooperation between the UK and France, Lancaster Accords, etc., etc., etc. Very strong ties between the UK and other European nations and the Scandinavians now. So I said in the piece, I did a piece in the Critic earlier in the week on the tariffs, and I think one of the potential and ironic outcomes of Trump's tariffs, and obviously the dialing back of the NATO relationship, is it will mean that it potentially will make Europe great again. If we think that one of the reasons why Europe hasn't been particularly great is because it's kind of outsourced a lot of its strategic thinking and it's kind of existing in a postmodern political space, a normative space, because the Americans have been doing the heavy lifting. So the Americans now are saying, well, we're going to crack on with China and East Asia. You guys are in Europe. Russia's your problem, really, not our problem. So you got to get on with it. So ironically, therefore, then we're undoubtedly going to see there's a structural moment that we're in now, which will reorder the agency of states and states people within this structural moment. And that structure will lend itself to greater defense coordination amongst Europe. Europe would like to become a strategic actor again. And that will have all kinds of implications for European security. It can go all kinds of ways, not least of which is the remilitarization of Germany. And obviously in the 20th century, when Germany is naturally a natural economic hegemon. So the EEC, the EU was partially about the constitutionalization of German power. And in return, it served Germany very well, etc. But now we're seeing a more decisive shift in Germany towards rearmament, which works quite well for Germans as well. I mean, they've been in the doldrums with their car industry. So we can see a lot of the German industry, if they can pull their finger out on net zero, etc., you can see that Germany could become a major defense supplier. So it's so interesting. Many of what Trump things that the balls that Trump has thrown into the air now could potentially lead to a kind of much stronger European identity and coordination, a reinvigorated German defense industrial complex, which spans across Europe, etc., pulling back even potentially from American defense suppliers. So Boeing and others now are very worried about what this all means for their F-35 programs, their F-16s, etc., because you may want more European sovereign defense capability if you can't rely upon the Americans anymore to give you the software codes, the tools, and the updates for your F-35s, etc., or even the GPS guidance systems. You will need more autonomous systems. So we're really in interesting times. So there's a lot going on.
And one thing to pick up on there is that, of course, there's this narrative from people like J.D. Vance and Trump as well, politically, that sort of portray America, and in particular the Rust Belt of America, as having paid an enormous cost for America being the global hegemon. But as you've been pointing out there, in fact, the fact that it's been able to be the superintendent of the liberal international order has actually in many ways benefited America for quite a long time. So, I mean, it seems to be a strange contradiction that they can't see that.
Well, I think there's a truth to their critique of globalization and neoliberal globalization. There's no doubt about it. The Washington Consensus in globalization under the Clinton and onwards has seen the emergence of very strong multinational corporation headquartered in the US that has carried out forms of outsourcing and forms of political economy changes that have impacted upon ordinary working class Americans. There's no doubt about that, but also political choices. So under Bush, massive tax cuts for the ultra rich. So the 1% have done very well out of globalization. So I think that the social forces that Trump represents and Brexit represented here, and also what is castigated, in my opinion, mistakenly as right-wing populism, that kind of sense on Europe at least, it speaks to a working class that feels very much left behind and betrayed by their nation states. So I think that's a very, very powerful critique. However, has to get, I mean, these are ultimately choices that the American multinational corporations have made. Plus, it also has benefited many Americans. You look at the GDP per capita statistics of America, it's way ahead. 2008, a parity with Europe. Nowadays, it's almost double in some instances. So they've done extraordinarily well. One of the reasons why America's done so well and Europe has done so well is because of the accession of China through the WTO onto the global economy. That massive manufacturing capacity of the Chinese and East Asian states in general has really dampened inflation down. It's very interesting. You go to an Argos catalogue. I don't know if you still have Argos on the high street. An Argos catalogue in the 1980s. I used to buy Star Wars figures, and you look at the prices in that catalogue. I had an old 1985 one, I think it was, the other day. I was looking through it, and the prices aren't that different to what they are now. So there's been the manufacturing capacity of East Asia and pumping goods has kept inflation low. So it's a far more complicated picture than China has done well at the expense of America. That simply isn't true. The data just does not support that. The GDP per capita in America is very strong. There have been elements of it. But then even then, on the manufacturing capacity and the manufacturing side, I mean, you could pay sweatshop laborers as awful as that may be in Vietnam or the Philippines or Shanghai or whatever to produce sweatshirts, or you pay Americans. But one presumes that you want those goods and those services on the shop in Walmart. So where that's manufactured. So I think the critique of Trump in relation to the unfairness of the international trading system just simply doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. He's doing it on a trade basis. So Americans earn money and they're paying for these things. And that's a kind of choice in some ways. I mean, the current account deficit, that again is largely in relation to political choices made by various presidents. When I think Clinton handed the presidency over to Bush, the Americans were running a surplus, and then Bush made a series of massive tax cuts while launching the Iraq War, and that's what really added massively to the deficit. So. See what I mean? So it's slightly more complicated than seeing this very much in sort of trade terms. So China sells more than we sell to them, therefore there's an unfairness to it. That's just not the way the global economy actually works.
Yeah, I mean, so perhaps the understanding of the unfairness is wrong-headed. And of course, another thing you've been pointing out to be an effect of this is undermining American hitherto dollar hegemony. And just tell us a bit more about why that would be so significant in changing America's position in the international order.
Well, the dollar is the international reserve currency has the international reserve currency status. Right? And so that gives the US state enormous, or one could say exorbitant privileges within the global economy. So essentially the Federal Reserve doesn't have to hold foreign currencies, so it doesn't have to balance that in that sense. When the US faces a massive crisis, say, for example, the 2008 financial crisis, rather than having to earn foreign currency to service its debts, it can simply print dollars. And because of the liquidity of the dollar, and it's a store of value and a trusted store of value, then others will just take those dollars. So it has all kinds of exorbitant, and therefore it can externalize financial crises. And also then we think about the incumbency of the dollar, because it's an international reserve currency status of the dollar. When vast majority of global trade is made in dollars. So for example, the oil trade is made, it's denominated in dollars. So therefore, if you're holding trillions and trillions of dollars, where does that money end up? It ends back up in Wall Street and US financial networks, which then gives enormous privileges and power to American-centered financial institutions, hedge funds and banks, etc. So the international reserve currency status of the dollar is enormously important. And even when we have major crises, so go back to the 2008 financial crisis, that was manufactured largely as a result of the securities innovations in Wall Street and the credit crunch, where did most of the world's money go? It went into treasury bonds and US debt, because it's seen as though, although the financial crisis originated in the American financial system, it's still seen, because of the liquidity of the financial system, the liquidity of the dollar, the store of value, as the safest harbor to go to. So that the US, essentially, if you look at the interest rates that the US had to pay on its treasury bills in 2008, it was going down. And interestingly, but the key point is this: what gives the US international reserve currency status and that privilege is fundamentally political. In other words, you have to trust the institutional frameworks, the institution, the rule of law, the transparency, the financialization of the capital account to put your money into the United States. If you lose that trust, if you become more like Russia, on the whim of somebody, then international investors will begin to lose confidence in the dollar, and they'll seek other areas to put their holding, or at least they'll hedge more. And so Trump reversed the tariffs, and one can make a very strong argument. Why did it reverse the tariffs? Because of what was happening in the bond markets. People were now saying, we no longer trust the dollar as much, so therefore you have to pay us more interest on our money, which itself has major implications. So gilt rates in the UK, if that goes up, that's a major problem for the Bank of England and for the government. It has to pay more in interest to serve its already enormous debt. Same for the Americans. So the international reserve currency status of the dollar is extraordinarily important. It gives the US incredible privileges, exorbitant privileges, and it has all kinds of very interesting geopolitical aspects to it too.
And so a key question is, how should Europe identify its role with respect to the new White House? And of course, there's been Starmer, for instance, trying to get together his coalition of the willing in Ukraine. But what that is really running up against is the fact that, as we've been talking about, the European military capacity isn't really there to really square up to Russia, and that's even if they wanted to in the first place. And so, how should Europe be thinking about what to do in relation to Ukraine, but also in defense terms more broadly?
I think the tragedy of what's going on with Trump and NATO is less about the desire on the Americans' part to pull more out of NATO, or at least to buck pass back to the Europeans. I think that's entirely fair. The Europeans have been riding on the Americans for a long time, and if you just read Robert Gates's resignation speech in 2011, US Defense Secretary, when he sort of castigated the Europeans and put them on notice, really. So that frustration with European security free riding has been quite common. And to put it in really brutal terms, why should American taxpayers in Alabama be paying tax to keep Munich safe, or rich holidaying, long annual leave, big pensions, big healthcare? There is a sense of injustice to that. It doesn't quite work like that. If you look at it, even on the Ukraine thing, essentially the idea that America's been paying, it's paid about 100 billion odd, or 60 billion, depending on which metric you use, on Ukraine. But essentially what's really happened there is America has given its old stocks, weapon stocks, to Ukraine, and used that money to pay mainly American defense contractors to re-up those stocks. So it's not like it's given money over to somebody and then it's taken it and used it. Essentially, it's a very much a sort of circular relationship there. They've kind of basically paid Lockheed and Boeing and others, to replenish what was old crappy inventory anyway, frankly. So that's what's actually going on. But what I think is the tragedy is the speed with which Trump is undoing major aspects of the so-called liberal international order, not just in tariffs and the global economy, but also in terms of its security alliances. So there's one thing saying, look, guys, we've given you a lot of warning, but now you've really got to step up. We'll give you a 5-year timeline. In 5 years, you've got to be far more cohesive. You've got to take far more on. There's one thing doing that, but to do what he seems to have done, which is sort of given up the ghost, put everything under the shade, pose it up to Putin when Putin, as I said earlier on, is really not done well. There's this talk now, if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he's going to go after the Baltic states and he's going to sweep across. That's just, I don't know how you can make that argument if you look at what's actually happened on the battlefield. It's really grinding attritional trench warfare. And Ukraine for the Russians is existential. It's not like NATO expansion. But Russia is a security maximizer, and Ukraine has been its red line for forever, really. And independently of little Russia and the Rus and the imperial fantasies that we may or may not attribute to the Putin regime, the facts are that Russia sees Ukraine as existential to its security, as a buffer state against the potential invasion across the West from the West. And so, the Swedes, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Napoleon, Hitler, that's not too wrong. I mean, you have to have cognizance of your enemy, quote unquote, national security perspective. And so that's how the Russians see Ukraine, like it or not. That's how they see Ukraine, independent of the desire to be a democracy and the sovereignty of Ukraine. That's how they see it. So for Russia, it's truly existential. For the West, far less so. It's a meat machine. It's a grinding machine. It's helped to grind the Russians down. Putin may want to go further, but can he? I mean, you Laurie, may want to be a billionaire sat on Copacabana Beach with a pina colada in your hand. But can you do it? You can't. You can't just will yourself into this stuff. So I think now what you would likely see, the Americans talk Europe down quite a lot, but Europe is still a technologically super advanced continent. It has the capacity, it needs to find the will, but it has the capacity to be very strong and very great. But it has to find the will, and the muddled thinking has really held Europe back for a long time. And that's partially also as a result of its over-reliance on the security guarantees of the Americans and the so-called liberal international order. In this new American light European order, I suspect a lot of that woolly thinking will fall away. And it's more than possible that in 5 to 10 years' time, we will see a sort of much more technologically advanced Europe, does away with a lot of the regulatory crud that's held it back. We could see a re-energized Germany, although Germany has problems, demographic problems. It has major demographic problems, energy problems, not least because of net zero and nuclear decommissioning. So, but when you're in a crisis, the crisis can sometimes focus one's mind. So you may well see that. The UK, what it should ultimately do, it should seek to, in many ways, try to avoid supranational capture in the regulatory orbit of the EU, which is very slow and cumbersome. Even the European EU knows this. That's why they're now doing kind of post or extra EU types of defence coordination. So the UK should ultimately, in many ways, leverage its offshore balancing role, which is historically what it's always done, be nimble, to build these multilateral and bilateral partnerships with major powers. France will now emerge as a major power in European geopolitics. It has sovereign nuclear guarantee. It's essentially, it drew the lesson from Suez 56. It needs to be independent of the Americans, unlike the Brits. So it's got a lot of good kit. It's got nuclear power. It's made a lot of quite good decisions in many ways. It's still very dependent upon German largesse, financial largesse. It's got a very fat public sector, but France will be geopolitically and militarily will emerge as a key player. The Scandinavians will too, with the Greenland and the Arctic type stuff now going on, and the need to contain Russia on the seas. And the East European states will as well. I think I've said this before in the different areas, but Poland now will become a major land. It already pretty much is a major land power, rapidly militarizing, 5% GDP on defense. It's bought loads of very good American kit, loads of very, very good South Korean kit, in particular the K2 tanks. So Russia by no means is kind of like just going to waltz in and start smashing things up. Far from it. Even on Ukraine, which barely had a military in 2014 and has had to sort of make and mend do, has managed in many ways to grind the Russian machine down. And that's just Ukraine. So I think that we're in a funny window now of a post-American security order, vulnerable, but luckily Russia is very weak. It will still do grey zone stuff. It will still do sabotage attacks, no doubt about that, and all the rest of it. But I think 5 to 10 years down the line, the situation geostrategically and geopolitically will look very different. Having said all that, and this is a kind of weird fantasy of mine, so you have to indulge me here, Laurie. Russia has national security interests. We don't want to be sat here in 10, 15, 20 years' time still talking about the Russian threat. So to the extent that Russia's national security interests are driven by a fear of Western expansionism, driven by a fear of NATO enlargement, driven by a fear of attacks on Russia, then we should, and also status fears as well. Russia feels status is a major aspect of world politics. Status, not just about national security, it's also about how you feel. You feel disrespected. Our status is a great civilization and we're not taking as seriously as we feel we should be taken. So there's a status claim here too. Read anything that Putin says, the history he draws upon. It's the great power status of Russia. So to the extent that we can ameliorate that stuff and have a dialogue with Russia, no matter how jarring that may be, in a way that could seek to ameliorate that and incorporate Russia into some post-NATO security architecture, so we don't have to keep worrying about Russia. We can have a dignified and respectful relationship, confidence building measures. And if we look at Ukraine, the tragedy of Ukraine, the absolute human tragedy of Ukraine, maybe a really fitting part of that would be using that tragedy to reboot that relationship in a way where my children or your children, your grandchildren don't have to worry about a war with Russia. And Russia has nuclear weapons. It has very, very good nuclear weapons, tactical and strategic nuclear weapons. People say its nuclear arsenal it's not true at all. Very powerful, very strong, very well maintained. So it's in all of our interest to have that dialogue. So to the extent that Trump has that vision, and I think that is part of it as well. This sense of frustration this potential World War III. If we can leverage and parlay this desperate human tragedy of Ukraine into some resolution of that, then that would be a truly wonderful thing to move us all on.
And so we've been speaking about the European economy, and of course one of the major effects on the European economy of the Ukraine war was the turning off of the taps, the Nord Stream pipeline. And of course one of them has now been blown up, and allegedly with American assistance. And I mean, would that be a long-term ideal way of patching back up the relationship to get those pipelines running again? Or is that too risky?
Well, the problem with the Nord Stream thing, right, is that if you really want to get down on how we explain Putin and the rise of Putinism, and that really goes to Germany's door. That really, really goes to Germany's door.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.